right, welcome to the Babies in Common show. We are back with Teresa Stewart, sleep consultant extraordinaire and child development specialist. And we're going to start into part 2. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I recommend that you stop and go back and listen to part 1, episode 16, and then continue on with this episode and hear all the great wisdom she has to share with you today.
What about crying? I know you mentioned, crying to extinction, which is a phrase, in air quotes, but also cry it out, the CIO method. And there's different versions of that, of course. But when we get to crying, one thing I've noticed is when I have been working with families, one family will say, "Oh my gosh, my baby's crying so hard." And I'll hear that as the baby fussing. But the parent hears that as the baby is crying and screaming. And then there's other times I'll work and I will be agitated, and I try not to show it, but that the baby is screaming like crazy, and the parent does not seem to pick up on the fact that the baby's screaming like crazy, like, "Oh, they're just fussing." And I'm like, that is not fussing. So how would you describe the different cries and what they mean? And should we be listening, like making babies cry like the old fashioned, well, babies need to cry, it's good for their lungs, which we know is false. But is there a piece of a baby's behavior or expression that is okay? And how do we judge how far to let that cry go, so to speak, before we act on it? Because I'm a huge fan of, like, as much as we can do to get the baby not to cry, that's the idea. But of course, if you're sitting on the toilet and you can't reach your baby, like, your baby's going to cry for a few minutes, or you're changing their diaper and you're like, "Dude, I'm doing this as fast as I can. I'm learning how to do this too." I think there's times like that. But to leave your baby by itself crying, and how do we judge whether that's a fuss or is that a cry? Is that communication? Like, say more about that.
Yeah, oh my goodness, this is could be an hour-long conversation just on crying and the language of cries, and so much to unpack here. So I think there's 3 things to consider overall. There's, physiologically, what can happen in a cry, and how can different cries have a different impact physiologically on the system. So we can talk about that. I think the second thing we want to talk about is the temperament of the baby. And some babies just cry more than others. And then I think there's the parental aspect and the interaction of parent and baby. And, 2 different parents, a cry may sound differently, or they may have a different response. And I see that a lot, even within a family, where, one parent will say, "That's definitely a distress cry," but the baby's other parent will be like, "No, I think that's just fussing." So it can be, a hard conversation to reconcile even within the 2 parents. So, I mean, all babies cry for some reasons. We're never going to have a baby who does not cry. I like to talk to families about, like, fussing versus protesting versus distress, but please know this is just like a guideline. This is just a way to think about it. Again, every baby, every family is a little bit different. All babies are going to fuss. All babies are going to, like, grunt and move around. So one of the things I see happen a lot in newborns, in that late part of the night, where as adults we want to be in deep sleep and our babies are coming out of light sleep, they might be fussing, grunting, moving around, and the parents think, "Oh my gosh, they're crying, I better pick them up, I better soothe them." When sometimes those loud sounds, a little bit of crying, the head side to side, the leg thumping, is really a baby's way of trying to go back to sleep. So sometimes we as parents intervene too soon when a baby is trying to work through it. But that would just be like light fussing, loud sounds, definitely not full on crying. With young newborns, first 4 months, I do tend to err on the side of caution, err on the side of, we're not going to spoil your baby, respond to your baby, they're crying for some reason. Do they need a diaper change? Are they hungry? Are they just seeking that contact? There's so many things that could be going on. I don't recommend extinction full on cry it out for anybody of any age, which I'll explain why in a moment. But in the first 4 months, I'm not even looking at trying to change the behavioral sleep at all. So if your baby is crying, respond to your baby. Now, the temperament of your baby matters, though, because for some babies, if they're crying, they do want that pickup. They do want to be held. Other babies just want a little bit of interaction, and I'll briefly share, experience with my son. So my daughter was my first, so she was my higher needs baby. She was the baby that needed, the round-the-clock nursing, the bouncing, a sling on, the holding, like 100 plus of everything is what that kid needed. So when my son was born 4.5 years after his sister, I just had it in my mind, like, okay, here we go again. And I have this very vivid memory of him at 10 weeks old, and he was crying. And I was trying to do all these things that worked for my daughter. And all of a sudden, I just had this revelation of my kid doesn't have a sleep problem. My kid is a mom problem. Because in this moment, I'm totally reading the baby in front of me wrong. Like, I'm trying to do for him what worked for his sister. He didn't want me to like force him on my boob and try to nurse him back to sleep. He didn't want the pickup. He just wanted a little bit of touch. You know, he was in the womb at that time. He just wanted some gentle pressure on his belly, a stroke of his head, and then he'd go back into that fussing and grunting and figure it out. So there is a little bit of figuring out, you know, who is your baby? And are you as the parent responding in a way that meets the baby's need? And that's hard work, and it doesn't come easy. And, you know, I as an expert can't tell, you know, an expert professional, I can't tell a mom or a dad or a parent how to feel about that cry. So there is some work we have to do, you know, between the baby and the parent there. But if a baby is in a distress cry, so distress cries tend to be very high pitched, some shrieking. If you imagine your baby had words with a distress cry, they're probably saying things like, I need help, something is wrong. The lips tend to really quiver. If you look at a baby's hands, they tend to be clenched in a fist. There tends to not be a whole lot of motion in the body. You know, this isn't a baby trying to figure it out. This is a baby really going into fight or flight. Something is wrong. And always, 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 no matter the age of the baby or the toddler, I would encourage that the family respond to that. And that's why I don't recommend an extinction method, because extinction methods say, you know, put your baby down and don't go back in. Let them cry it out. And some sleep consultants recommend that. It's pretty popular in books and blogs. Sometimes pediatricians recommend it. But what I have found is that when babies are in distress, if they continue to cry, will they ultimately fall asleep? Yes, because physiologically their body's going to get to a point where that sleep pressure is so high that they can't resist it. Have they learned anything in that experience that's going to help them build a skill? No. Emotionally, have they learned that perhaps they won't be responded to? That's possible. Chemically, what happened in their brain is they released a lot of cortisol. So that is why I don't recommend the extinction for any age if there is that distress cry. Again, in the first 4 months, you know, baby's just kind of fussing, and you feel like you want to respond, but you also want to see, you know, could I try to help the baby go back to sleep with as least intervention? I do have families sometimes explore with what I call the ladder of intervention. So you're going to start low on the ladder and go up as needed. And there's nothing wrong with going up. But again, maybe your baby's like my son and he just needed a little bit of touch. So then you stay low on the ladder and soothe the touch. But if that's not working, go up the ladder, pick your baby up. Maybe your baby just needed that pickup. If that's not working, go up the ladder, you use your motion. That's not working, go up the ladder, and now you're feeding. So you can always explore with something like that, because what that does is keeps you present with your baby. And, you know, for those of you who have a baby who cries no matter what, I don't want you to feel guilty. Some babies do cry more than others, but your presence, your interaction when they're crying also offers a protective mechanism and prevents that cortisol from releasing in the brain.
I think I also noticed that some parents don't move their baby as vigorously. We can never want their head shaking, of course, but they feel like if they're just holding their baby in a cradle and shushing, and sometimes the shushing is so quiet that like baby can't even hear you. They're screaming way louder than you're shushing. Like we need to get louder with the shushing and also more deliberate with a nice rhythmic pattern.
Right.
And oftentimes in an upright position where their head is above their hips, which is above their feet. You know, not
Right.
laying sideways sometimes is a really better way to go up and down, help them regulate their brain and get organized so that they can calm down and go back to sleep. Sometimes, especially if it's your first baby, or like you're saying, you're operating on what your first baby did, you know, that doesn't work. And the other thing I've seen parents do too is, like you're saying you were doing with your son similarly, is parents who want to sleep with their babies are not sleeping well. This is not this common. They're not that common, but like their babies aren't sleeping well. And so I've worked with them, you know, just in talking with parents as, you know, whether it's like in my group that I do
Mhm.
or just they message me about things and I'm like, well, maybe your baby doesn't want you to be sleeping next to them. Maybe they're like, ugh, why are you always here? I want my hands and legs free. Can I have my own sleep surface? And then the parents sad because they're like, I was planning on nursing and co-sleeping and now my baby doesn't want to be. And they put their baby down in their own bed, even next to the parents' bed. And the kid's like, yes, thank goodness I've got so much space now, which is the opposite of what I think most babies want. But
Mhm.
it's exploring, wait, am I doing this the opposite way my baby's actually wanting? So it's really
Yeah.
interesting you say that about your son.
There's so much trial and error, right? And I think that's hard for a lot of parents. And when I'm working with families one-on-one and they're tracking baby sleep, like they most families really want me to give them like, this is exactly why your baby did this on Monday, and this is exactly why your baby did this on Tuesday. And although I can pick up on patterns pretty, quickly biologically, and sometimes I can tie it into like feed and development, there's also many times where I'm like, I honestly don't know, because your baby's not a robot. And we all have good days and bad days in many different ways, and we all sometimes eat more one day than the other, or sleep longer than the other. But there's a lot of trial and error, and I would say to anybody, either having a baby or in this phase, don't be afraid to try new things. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, try it again. If it worked on Monday and doesn't work on Tuesday, don't beat yourself up. There's a lot of change that happens so drastically in newborns.
And just because
I'd
your
love
baby
to.
sleeps
Oh,
well this week doesn't mean they're going to sleep the same way the next week either. Yeah.
Fortunately not.
But I think, do you have a bumper sticker so that says your baby's not a robot? I love that.
That can be
yeah,
a
and I'd like
chapter
to.
in my dissertation.
Yes, exactly. I'd like to speak as a mom for a second, not as a nurse, as a mom who had a very high needs baby who did not sleep well and affected the sleep of the whole family. A couple mantras or mottos or whatever you want to call them that I think really helped me during that time, because it's emotional, was when the baby was crying, I would actually say out loud, of course I'm holding my baby at this point. I'm trying to respond to their distress cry, and maybe they're still crying, and I would say, you're not giving me a hard time, you're having a hard time, right? You're not giving mommy a hard time, you're having a hard time. Because when, if you do have a colicky baby or a baby that cries a lot, um, uh, you know, it can feel personal. Like it can feel very like, what is wrong with me that I can't help my baby right now? What am I doing wrong? What is wrong with my baby? And sometimes we pathologize like
Mhm.
normal temperament or normal newborn sleep. And so, I would say, my baby's not giving me a hard time, he's having a hard time. Teresa isn't giving me a hard time, he's having a hard time. And that would help me like humanize my baby, who, like you said, Teresa, if your baby is having a distress cry and they can talk, what it might say is, I need help, right? Like, help me, mommy. So, or help me, daddy. And so saying like, I'm going to help you, or, good thing you told me that you needed help, is mommy's here for you. Like, talking it out loud with your baby can really help you keep the, positive emotions as part of the story, because it is really hard. The other thing that I would say is, in the first, few weeks of getting to know each other as parents, we talk a lot about infant attachment, and how important that is in responding to your baby as part of like helping their brain learn that they're going to get their needs met when you respond to them. And, people that are looking for help to get more sleep, if you're somebody listening out there that's tried Cry It Out before or has read about Cry It Out, I don't think anybody who is researching that is a bad person. You're desperate. I've been there. Like I've so absolutely been there. And when everybody in your life, sometimes it feels like is telling you to do something like that, it feels like it's the only choice, because you get to a point where you're so tired, you don't know what else to do. But know that there are other strategies out there, that can help meet your baby's needs and not resort to what Teresa's describing as extinction cried out, which is letting your baby build into a distress cry and not going in there and fighting all of your instincts as a parent
The other
to
thing
go
you
in and soothe your baby.
Mhm.
No judgment, but the reality is there's a ton of research that says that is harmful to babies' brains. That's harmful to babies' brains and to their development emotionally and physically. So
The other thing that you
you were going to
mentioned
say something.
too, yeah, you mentioned colicky. And what I hear parents say is, well, I was told my baby's colicky, so I just kind of have to let it be until they're 4 months
Mhm.
old and they'll grow out of it. Whereas as a lactation consultant, I look at colicky and I go, no, that is a problem. That's your baby going, I don't feel good. Please help me. And oftentimes, I can't say 100%, but oftentimes if I can get in there and do a consult and sort of work on what's going on with feeding, oftentimes the colicky, quote unquote, behavior goes away because now the baby
Mhm.
doesn't feel so bad.
Right.
And Melissa, can you share a little bit about your colicky, quote unquote, baby and what ended up working out with her?
Yeah, so my daughter Marcy she's just fussed all the time. She was very, very, very fussy, and she was my third, so I'm like, oh, I guess we just have another one like the first. Darn. I was gonna luck out. Like my second was very easy baby. And so but she would fuss and fuss and fuss, and this is just like 2 months old. And I'm an experienced breastfeeder by this point. I breastfed my first till he was 3, my second till he was 2.5. My daughter, side note, was in the hospital at Boston Children's when she was a week old because she had an infection. And so I just thought that, like, maybe her belly was hurting because she was on antibiotics, or maybe, like, she was just recovering from that infection. And so there was a lot of other life factors that were happening that could have made it so. But I happened to go to Breast Milk and Conversation, which is Jeanette's breastfeeding new parenting support group. And then afterwards we went out for lunch, and she noticed that I really couldn't even eat my meal because I kept having to stand up and bounce her, and she'd drink for 2 seconds, on my breast, and then she'd like, and then she wouldn't want to nurse anymore, and then she'd only nurse like 5 minutes at a time, and she was gaining perfectly fine. But Jeanette was like, can we do a lactation consult together? And I'm like, for real? I've breastfed for like 5.5 years total, like, I think. And she was like, no, just let me do a little investigation. So I actually had a professional lactation consult with Jeanette. She came to my house, and turns out I was spraying her like a fire hose. My letdown was too much. I had too much milk. That, yeah, um, she wasn't losing weight or not gaining enough because I had so much milk, but my letdown was so intense that she was stopping feeding before she was actually full. And so it looked to me like a baby that was guzzling at the breast and was done with the feeding, but then was still fussing, was actually a hungry baby. And once Jeanette gave me a special type of nipple shield that I only used for a couple of months, but just until my daughter kind of grow up a little bit and not and be able to handle my milk flow a little bit better, the colic, quote unquote, disappeared. Like, she went from a very fussy baby to a very easy to soothe baby. And I'm forever grateful for you for that. And it just goes to show you, it doesn't matter if you're a nurse or an experienced breastfeeder, or you've had 15 kids before, or know how to deal with colic, or going for a feeding consult, whether you're breast or bottle, formula, or human milk feeding, can be helpful if your baby is exhibiting signs of being fussy, told that they're gassy, or that they're, whatnot. So
Yeah,
that's my story.
sometimes it's a tongue tie, sometimes it's a torticollis, sometimes it's about your milk flow. It's so fascinating, but really investigating, customizing that to be like, what is happening with your child versus just making assumptions on, well, try this, try this, try this. It can make your life happier so much quicker to really figure out what's a tool we can use here once we figure out what the problem is.
Yeah, and definitely, I mean, feed and sleep are so interconnected, especially in those early years. And I'm not a lactation consultant. I have some questions that I screen on my questionnaire, and as I'm working with the family, if something seems to be perpetuating beyond my area of expertise, I definitely refer out. And I think that people should have feeding consults just right away. I think that when babies are born, just like we go see pediatricians, we should probably see somebody, whether we're bottle feeding or breastfeeding or a combination of both, because every baby's different. And, Melissa, as you just said, it doesn't matter if we've breastfed other babies before, or, certainly for me, as a professional in child development, even though I know a lot of things that help a lot of families, it's a little bit different when you're going through it on your own with your own kids. So sometimes what seems like a sleep problem or a soothing problem is very much what the two of you just described. Some adjustments are needed with feeding first.
Awesome. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about where the baby sleeps before we talk about, we've hinted at this 4-month circadian rhythm. So we're keeping you on the line for that one. But before we do that, can we talk a little bit about, you mentioned safe sleep, and when people hear safe sleep, many people are thinking what the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends, which is that the baby sleep in their own crib or their own sleep surface. Of course, it's always good advice to have no blankets or bumpers or, pillows or stuffed animals in that baby sleep surface, of course, because that could be a suffocation risk. But it's very, very much promoted in America that the baby be in their own crib. Now, what I will say is the American Academy of Pediatrics pretty recently came out and extended their recommendation on how long babies should sleep in the same room as their caregiver, which I think is good. I see you guys nodding your heads as well. So they used to say, for the first 3 to 6 months, your baby should be in the room with you on their separate sleep surface. Now they're saying 6 to 12 months, that it reduces risk of SIDS, and it also can promote better feeding, especially breastfeeding, if the parents are breastfeeding. But a lot of families, especially breastfeeding families, are sharing a bed with their baby. What some people call co-sleeping or bed sharing. Can you talk a little bit about, because you work with all families, right? Like your babies who, and you talk about like what their goals are. Like, is it your goal to get the baby to sleep in their own bed, or are you co-sleeping? So can you talk a little bit about safe sleep in all of those different situations?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there are some, sleep consultants out there who will only work with families if they are putting a baby in a crib. And some of my colleagues have clients sign forms and saying that I won't co-sleep. So there is a group out there who would not have the same conversation that we're about to have. If a family is bed sharing and they want to continue to bed share, that is not a problem with me, and I will support that family in those goals. I love the work of Dr. James McKenna out of the University of Notre Dame Mama and Baby Sleep Lab. So for families who have either found that they've sort of defaulted to bed sharing, like it wasn't their intention, but okay, baby's here, or they are saying, yes, I want to continue to bed share, I will share the work of James McKenna and his research, because there are some safety considerations, with having a baby, in our sleep space. Really the American Academy of Pediatrics Safe Sleep Guidelines, again, this is where culture and society comes into play, because many cultures around the world are bed sharing and have lower rates of SIDS and suffocation than we do in our country. So is it necessarily the act of sharing a sleep space with the baby, or is it more the behavior of the parent, before sleep or during sleep, or the physical environment? We do know, Melissa, as you said, that having a lot of soft fabrics in a sleep space is a safety risk. So if a family is bed sharing, we want to really limit the pillows. We don't want the baby to be under the blankets. Ideally no dogs or cats sleeping in the bed as well with that newborn baby. But I do support, a family if they do want to bed share. And I'm using bed share, very intentionally here, because the co-sleeping term can be misleading. Some people think of co-sleeping as in the same sleep space as the parent, where the way the AAP uses it, they consider co-sleeping to be room sharing. So, room sharing versus bed sharing are just how I'm trying to think through it. Did you want me to go into like safety in particular, or do you want me just to talk a little bit more about like how the co-sleeping environment could work overall with sleep?
I think I love that you are working with both types of families, because you also have to think about the families who I've seen who really want their baby to sleep and they want to sleep, but the parent themselves, even if they're breastfeeding, they don't feel comfortable. They can't stretch out, or no matter what we do, we can't get them to be comfortable feeling safe with their baby in their bed. And I think so that's really good that you're going to work with the families depending on what their goals are. I know some families will put their baby between the parents, and that is not recommended, even if you have one of those little contraptions, which are not a good idea. One thing that I've noticed over the years is that parents don't know that in the United States, products for babies are not vetted for safety before they're put on the market. And in most cases, those will not be recalled unless multiple babies die. So there's a lot of products that we think, well, they're for sale, they must be safe. And maybe they even have one of those little things on them that say like parents award of some brand, right? But that parent award just basically means that the company paid that organization to award them with this award. It doesn't mean that it was really that safe of a product. So that's hard. And sleeping too, one thing that you mentioned about the AAP guidelines is they've also come out and said that if you are going to bring your child into bed with you because you're desperate and you want to get sleep and you weren't planning on sleeping with your baby, the best place to accidentally fall asleep with your baby is in your bed. It is not on a couch. It is not on a lazy boy chair or some sort of big puffy chair. That is actually dangerous. And having your partner who's or a non breastfeeding partner falling asleep with their baby on their chest is not safe. So it's really looking at the guidelines. My favorite book right now for parents is Sweet Sleep. Right. I'm sure you have others that maybe you could recommend, but what are you noticing related to sharing a room, like co-sleeping with the baby versus the one that attaches to the bed versus the bassinet that's next to the bed versus the crib that's 6 feet away? Are you noticing any trends with how babies do in one or the other?
Oh boy. Can I talk specific products, or do you not want me to mention a product by name?
No, now you can.
Okay.
I just didn't want to mention that other product before.
Okay. I'm not sure. It might be the same product you were thinking about, though. But this is just all my opinion. Nobody else's. So a product that I was not comfortable with ever, and I'm so glad has been recalled, is the Rock and Play. And that was a big one that, like, right from the beginning, it just felt not safe to me in any way. Not physically. I was really worried about, that suffocation and the asphyxiation as the chin fell to the chest. I was also really worried about that product because it's such a hard surface, and we were seeing a lot of babies develop plagiocephaly and torticollis who slept in it. And then also what I was finding with that is, again, it was such a containment product that babies weren't moving as much as they needed to. And a lot of OTs and PTs who I network with, we're seeing a lot of babies come out of the Rock and Play and not being able to do the fine motor and the gross motor skills. So I know it's recalled, but I still know a lot of people who have it, from previous children or, secondhand use. So I would really encourage not to use the Rock and Play. The SNOO is pretty popular right now, which is made by Dr. Harvey Karp, really building on his 5 S's. And I have to be honest, it's not my favorite product. And what I'm seeing as a pretty strong trend in the past couple of months is parents are coming to me with babies between 6 and 9 months old who are now physically too big for the SNOO. And they're having a really, really hard time transitioning the baby to any other type of sleep, because for so long the baby's been swaddled down in the SNOO, not learning how to integrate its reflexes, not starting to master going back to sleep or moving in sleep and knowing that's okay. The SNOO has a motion component to it, which can be great for soothing newborns. But if you're a 6 to 9 month old baby and you've been sleeping your whole life in motion, and now you're at the stage where you're going through cause and effect learning, your brain is rapidly changing. So I've just been seeing a lot of families lately who are coming to me desperate, honestly, to get their baby out of the SNOO. And it's a much harder situation than if they were sleeping elsewhere in the first 6 to 9 months. Again, I do work with a lot of families who bed share. Jeanette, as you said, trying to not have the baby in between the two parents, but closer to, the nursing parent, especially because there's that hormonal interaction that stimulates the brain and helps keeps our baby safe. A lot of the families I work with have been co-sleeping and bed sharing with mom, and the other parent has been sleeping in another bed. So they often come to me because, wait a minute, we didn't anticipate doing this, for many months. I kind of want to sleep next to my partner again, but so it can really impact the whole family. Another pretty common situation I work with around bed sharing is families with an older child who have been bed sharing, 2, 3, 4 longer years with kiddo number 1, and now want to move the older child out of the bed before the baby comes. And that, again, is a topic probably on its own for another day, but that can be really emotional. And we want to be really mindful, of how we're going to change that older child's behavior, because we don't want the older child to feel like, wait a minute, I'm being kicked out of the sleep space because of the baby. So that can be a delicate balance that we are navigating. A lot of my clients do a room share, in accordance with the AAP guidelines. I don't know what you guys have found with your patients and clients, but I found that a lot of people feel a lot of pressure to now go for the full year because the AAP now says, 6 to 12 months old versus the 3 to 6. But after the 6-month mark, it's not necessarily working for the family anymore. Because again, this is where infant sleep starts to mature a little bit more, where they're getting the consolidated sleep in the first 4 to 6 hours of the night, but still restless as the night goes on. So it starts to become my baby is okay and sleeping well, but I as the parent am not because they're really loud. So I have found that a lot of families have a hard time with that extension of the AAP guidelines.
I think a lot of people do really well with the attachable crib or the attachable co-sleeper,
Mm-hmm.
as it's called. That's one brand. And that works really well. And then other people say, well, I attached it, but that's just where I keep my stuff because the baby wouldn't tolerate being on there, But at least you have a little extra space, which is helpful. So it's really kind of trying different things. Some people are doing floor beds.
Yep.
You mentioned that you worked with some families in Japan, and I understand that's very common in Japan for everybody to have floor beds. And it's been amazing to watch in our community of so many families sharing with each other that like just put your mattress on the floor because they're like afraid for the baby to fall out of the bed. And eventually the baby starts to crawl. And so any bed rail you might put in isn't useful for a crawling baby. It's like, I know you like how your bedroom looks, but take the bed apart, put it away, just put the mattress on the floor, and everybody will be happier for the next 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
That seems to work really well for people.
Yeah, in the interest of full disclosure, my mattress has been on the floor since my first was 10 months old because that's the only way he would sleep. And so I strongly recommend anybody listening who, even if you co-sleeping, bed sharing is the last thing in the world that you ever want to do with your kids, I still recommend looking into it, especially if you're pregnant or your baby even is sleeping well, to know. And Dr. James McKenna and his research is phenomenal. And that's Teresa, I highly recommend what she recommended, because you might find that you are desperate some night for sleep and you fall asleep with your baby in your bed, and that wasn't ever your intention. You want the place that you fall asleep with your baby or your baby falls asleep to be safe. So even if you're not someone who, like I am a reluctant close sleeper. I would prefer not to have anybody in my bed, to be quite honest. I want to be naked and with nobody, and but my baby wants to be with me, and that's how we all get the most sleep. And so even if you're not someone that's planning on bed sharing, I still recommend you do a little bit of research into what safe bed sharing is, so that if you find yourself in a position where you are bed sharing, it is safe for your baby and not. And Dr. James McKenna has a whole list of things that is, recommended to safely bed share with a baby.
Yeah, if this, you could just start with Googling the Safe Sleep 7.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of his work, collaborated with some other people in the world of breastfeeding to put together these 7 guidelines of like, you cannot sleep with your baby unless you can meet all of these guidelines. And then if you want to delve into it further, Sweet Sleep is one book. Dr. McKenna just came out with a new book as well. There's some great resources there.
So Teresa, you've mentioned how babies mature in their sleep and their circadian rhythm, and how newborn babies are just a totally different animal than a 4-month-old baby, right? They're like fetuses. They're just like fetuses on the outside. But at some point, they start to become more baby-like. And so you see all over the baby blogs and the new parent chat rooms about the 4-month sleep regression, blah, 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 right? It's like this. And so I hate the term regression. I have banned it from my vocabulary as a parent because everybody talked about it with my first, and I felt like he was always regressing. Why is regression not a good term for what happens around 4 months? And what would you describe as a better term? And what really is happening in that baby's brain, and how does that change their sleep?
Yeah, great question. And I'm right there with you on hating that term regression. I would love if everybody could, reframe how we see our developing children in so many ways. So first of all, it's important to note that this is really based off of a baby's due date. So for babies who were born before 38 weeks, You always want to go by their adjusted age for the first 2 years of life whenever you're talking about biologically what's happening with sleep, or if you're looking at a resource around sleep schedule. So, if my baby was 6 weeks early, then I'm always going to make that adjustment when I'm looking at age-based recommendations. So I do want to be clear on that. So this sleep regression, in air quotes with a frown, can happen at different points for different babies. It really can happen anywhere from 3 months to 5 months post the due date. And 4 is just the average of 3 and 5, so it kind of got its nickname there. But for some babies, it does start as early as 3 months post the due date, and some not until 5 months. Biologically, every single baby is going to go through this. Where some people feel like, oh, my baby never had that, is just more temperament based. Some babies adjust quicker than others. Some babies, protest change less. But I can promise you that biologically, every baby's body goes through this. And basically, somewhere between that 3 and 5 month window post due date is when your circadian rhythm now does start to mature and take over. So in a baby's body for the very first time, they have to figure out, how do I align the sleep pressure that we talked about before with the circadian rhythm? And again, some babies' bodies just very organically do it, and most babies have a hard time figuring it out. This is typically when bedtimes will start to drift earlier. So one sign might be that, okay, my baby that was going to bed, 10, 11, or midnight really is now ready for a 7, 8, 9 o'clock bedtime. So you might notice that what used to be that last nap or chunk of naps is turning into consolidated sleep. So that's a good aspect, that usually bedtime drifts earlier. This is the age where you can now start to space naps a little bit differently, because how the sleep pressure builds during the day is going to either help or hurt the circadian rhythm's ability at night to start to consolidate longer stretches. Again, there's so many ranges of normal here, but just as an guideline, most babies around 4 months old are still going to need 4 naps a day. Some are ready for 3, but usually it's still 4. When they start to go through this circadian change, which is really a state of maturation, it's not a regression at all, it's a sign of growth. And I really like to talk to families about thinking of it as like a slingshot. So before our babies can go really far and achieve the next stage of development, there is a step back. And that is true probably throughout adolescence. There's these periods of the slingshot where we go back and then go forward, but it's not a regression at all. And if we can just reframe that and how we talk about it, and as parents, how we think about it, then it kind of also goes into what you were saying earlier, Melissa, that, my baby isn't giving me a hard time. My baby's having a hard time. My baby is trying to figure something new out. But bedtimes usually drift earlier. As long as feeding is going well, baby's gaining weight well, there's no developmental concerns, no health concerns that we're looking at the moment. Usually now we're getting that 5 to 6 hour stretch of sleep instead of the 2 to 4 that we talked about earlier. And this is also when you can really start to have consistent bedtime and wake time. So keeping the bedtime and wake time consistent within a 30-minute window can be really helpful around 4 months old.
I like to call it the 4-month sleep progression.
Yeah.
I always tell people it's a leap, right? So we have a slingshot, we've got progression, we've got a leap. Yeah. And so can we all just agree to ban regression? Because that just makes everybody feel bad. Nobody wants to think their baby's regressing, but really your baby is doing so much learning. And parents also, what's hard to hear as not only a nurse, but as a friend, when there are parents who have done, cry it out, I often hear from them that they have to keep repeating it when something happens. And I hear this a lot. Well, cry it out, but just know that if the baby gets sick or they learn something new, you have to do it all over again. That doesn't to me, just think about that for a second, right? Like, if you have to repeat this technique every time the baby has a big growth, a big developmental change, then maybe that technique is not in alignment with a growing, developing baby. Whereas kind of this holistic approach that you're talking about, Teresa, and understanding sleep biology and circadian rhythm and sleep pressure, and is taking into consideration that these babies are going through these incredible changes. And something else I learned from you which I never knew, makes total sense, is how you were saying that a lot of babies, not a lot of babies do not have REM sleep paralysis.
Yes.
Right? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this, I thought something was wrong with my kids when they would be doing this. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, sure. So first, let me just say what you briefly hit on. During these periods of progression and leaves, often scheduling changes are necessary. And if we adjust the daytime nap lengths and duration of wakefulness, then it just gets easier at night. And that's where if you're hearing families who say, well, I'm doing cry it out and it's not working. Well, yeah, because you're not adjusting the biology. You're trying to target it solely from a behavioral perspective that's not even developmentally appropriate, but a behavioral perspective when the real challenge at the time is adjusting biology. So that's just important to talk about a little bit more. What was the question? Sorry. You want me to talk more about,
I was just saying about just another point about biology that people don't realize. They pathologize what you're what you say as is REM sleep paralysis.
Yeah, thank you. So in the adult body, when we are in REM sleep, we don't move a lot, we don't talk a lot, unless we have a sleep disorder. So if somebody's telling you, well, actually you are talking and moving a lot when you're in REM sleep, you better go talk to your doctor. But if we don't have a sleep disorder, we get into REM sleep, we're pretty quiet, we're pretty still. Children younger than 4 years old, don't have REM paralysis. So they are moving a lot, they are talking a lot, they're crying out a lot. And this is part of what I was sharing with the two of you earlier, where, sometimes in the morning hours when babies are fussing and grunting and moving, we respond too soon because it's not that they're fully awake. Their body's just doing what it's supposed to be doing to try to get back into a deeper sleep. But it's not often talked about. So we think that there's something wrong with my baby. I better pick them up and stop this. When it's totally
exactly. We pathologize it and think, oh, I've got to let them just, not understanding the biology. My daughter will crawl in her sleep. She'll be dead asleep and she will be crawling and like banging her head up against like the wall, but she's asleep. It wakes me up. And some people might say that, like their baby's crawling and they move up against the crib rails and they're like, I have to remember, like, I have to kind of open my eyes, like, wait, is she like awake or asleep? And a lot of times she'll just like flop herself down like a fish out of water at some point and go back to sleep, quote unquote. But she's she's just like a dog that like runs in their sleep. That's nothing wrong, it's just that's normal for her.
I'm glad you mentioned that. One of my favorite stages is actually when babies just start to push up on all fours and they do it in their sleep and they're like vigorously rocking and parents are like, what is happening, what is wrong? And oftentimes too, around 9 to 10 months old, babies will start to pull up in their sleep and they're standing in their sleep. But then what happens is they wake up and they totally panic because why am I in this position? I don't know how I got here. Maybe I haven't yet mastered getting back down. So now I'm crying. And this too is why something like an extinction method isn't going to work, because your baby might legitimately be stuck and not yet have the skills. So we go in, we soothe our baby, we move their body for them, we teach them they're okay. That's going to be much more long-term helpful than just focusing on the behavior in that moment.
Well,
yeah,
also,
when you say
kids can't talk, they can't even talk. So they're trying to communicate whichever way they can. But if we treated an 8-year-old like that, or our partner like that, like, oh, they're crying, well, I'm just gonna let them cry it out in the other room, they would complain to your mother-in-law about it and be like, I was crying and upset and he just was like out in the living room watching football and didn't even care. They'd be like, well, get rid of him, why are you even with that guy? Or like, you would not appreciate that if your kid was 12 years old and crying about something and you're like, I don't know what they're upset about, but let them cry. That would not be appropriate as a parent. So why are we doing that with a baby who can't even communicate with words and tell us what's wrong? We need to be investigating that.
Yeah, there's a saying that I love. A lot of the work that I do with older kiddos is around, emotional intelligence and emotional well-being. So there's a phrase, what if for an entire generation, stop crying became listening? So what if we really truly listen? And it's never too early to shape and support the emotional well-being of our babies. So by responding to crying, and Melissa, you were talking about this earlier too when you were like talking to Marcy when she was crying, but saying things like, I am here, you are safe. Like maybe the cry isn't going to stop, but why and how did that become the goal in parenting, to necessarily stop their cry or stop the emotion? And you're entirely right, Jeanette, that with our older kids, there tends to be more of a willingness to talk and soothe and investigate. But with our youngest babies, it's more like, just stop, don't cry. We have some digging, I think, to do there as a society on how that became our approach for many people.
I'm thinking we might need a weekly one of these with you so we can.
Yeah, right. Because you've touched a little bit on mental health, you mentioned, I just want to, before we end our show, a couple more questions. One is, can you just speak, I know it's hard because we could be in a whole nother show, but briefly about what kind of adult or parent aspects can impact baby sleep? Why isn't it always a baby sleep problem? Could there be something going on with the parents that they are interpreting as a baby sleep problem, what might be something mental health wise?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think at the basic level, all of us have stress, and all of us need to figure out how we are providing, self-care, and self-care is not a luxury, it's a necessity. But what are we doing on a regular basis to help ourselves be regulated and manage our stress? Because, again, babies are not robots, they're humans. They pick up on our energy, they pick up on our breathing, they pick up on our body language. And, if you pick up a crying baby, and you're feeling really stressed out, your baby's going to notice that. So I encourage parents, just on a regular basis, think about your own body. If you're holding a baby, but you're like hunched up, right? Your like shoulders are up to your ears, and you're holding your breath, and your fists are closed. Like, that's a lot of stress and tension. Baby's going to pick up on that. And this might be a time where maybe you do need to put your baby down somewhere safe and they cry for a little bit, because you need to regulate and manage your stress. And, you as a parent, it's so important to do that, or trade off with your partner or a grandparent or somebody. So just on a very, foundational level, think of your own body language, your stress, your breathing, your self-care, because it does carry over into our parenting. I do work with a number of women who are experiencing a perinatal mood disorder. About 5 years ago, I completed a post-grad program through the Postpartum Stress Center in Philadelphia, because I just felt like I was seeing more and more of this in my clientele, and I wanted to make sure I was offering, the best support I could. And, I'm not a therapist, I don't treat for this, but I do, build in my knowledge into the way I support a family with sleep, and I do have the ability, to screen and refer out. But sometimes what feels like a baby sleep problem is, a mom or dad experience some anxiety, and you're just like so hyper focused on like that data collection and trying to figure, we all try to figure things out, but really getting stuck and trying to figure out what's going on in the baby. That sometimes you can't see the progression, you can't see the things coming together, that you're just really stuck on, what feels wrong to you. Or, Jeanette, you were talking earlier about the cry, like sometimes you hear babies cry and to you it just seems like, some fussing, but to the parent, it feels very intense and like distress. And that could be related to PPD or PPA or the birth experience. There might be some trauma that we need to support that family around that is impacting how they identify the cry. The parental relationship. I love the work of John Gottman at the Gottman Institute. Wonderful resource if anybody is interested. He has a study that has shown that 69% of new parents, so baby number one, we just became parents, 69% of new parents are experiencing pretty significant stress in their partner relationship, because the transition from partnering to parenting is really hard. So a lot of times, families come to me because they just feel like this isn't working for us as partners, and we can't get on the same page on what we want to do with the baby. So it's not necessarily a baby sleep problem, but it's helping the family figure out, where's the baby going to sleep? How are we going to soothe? What are our goals collectively? So again, physical body, breath, self-care, figuring out if there is any perinatal mood disorders that might be going on, or just generalized mental health needs, and then looking at that partner relationship as well.
We've learned so much from you today, Teresa. We've learned that infant sleep has a lot to do with biology and with, like you said, the tip of the iceberg. And and why it's not, when it comes to infants, that your babies aren't manipulating you, that your baby has needs, mental, physical, emotional needs that we can learn strategies to meet. And that it's not about just changing the behavior of sleep, but so many more things. So I'd love to ask and bust one more myth before we go, and is that it's that age-old myth that adding formula or solids is going to help the baby sleep more. How many times have we heard that? So can you end us off with speaking to that myth?
Yeah, unfortunately it is a myth. So the circadian rhythm that we started to explore today is impacted by a number of things. It's impacted, by sleep pressure. It is impacted by some environmental things like the light that we were talking about and the temperature. It's a very physiological aspect of our body where we need to drop blood pressure, body temperature, and release melatonin. So all of those things can impact sleep consolidation. What does not impact sleep consolidation is where your calories come from. Now, if there is a baby who's not gaining well, not eating well, whatever mode of feeding we're using, that's a legitimate concern, and we might need to, figure out what's going on with the feeding. But replacing breast milk with formula or adding in solids, unfortunately, it's not that easy. It's not going to immediately lead to more consolidation. Because again, where calories come from does not impact the circadian rhythm at all. And honestly, what I do find, if anything, sometimes, introducing solids too soon actually works against us because the baby's digestive system wasn't ready for it. And now they're waking up at night, with gas or bowel movement issues or just discomfort.
So Teresa, do you mean to tell me that there are babies who need help sleeping, whether or not they're formula fed or human milk fed? Because I feel like this is something that people are, they always blame it on the breast milk, blame it on the boob, blame it on the mom, blame it on something she ate. But, it's biology, right? So whether there are babies that are formula fed and babies that are human milk fed, babies that are fed by bottle and babies that are fed by breast that might need help consolidating their sleep and might need help with nighttime wake-ups.
Yeah, might need help consolidating, might need help nighttime wake-ups, and might still need a nighttime wake-up for quite a while. I mean, again, wide range of what is normal. Some babies are ready to drop all night feeds by 6 months old. Some are. In my experience, most are not. But there are some out there who can, do a 10 to 12 hour night without any nighttime feedings. But there's plenty who need 1 or 2 nighttime feedings until a year old, whether they are breast milk, formula fed, combination of both, whether they're 1 or 3 solids. It's okay. It's more than okay for babies to need night feeding.
Absolutely. Man. All right. Well, we could go on and on, but thank you so much for sharing all of this super important, vital information and busting myths and making sure that we have more evidence. And of course, everybody listening or watching can make sure that if they need your help, they can contact you directly and learn more about what you do on your website, stewartfamilysolutions.com. And so man, I would definitely shoot us a message with a couple other resources that you like so I can share those with people. So thank you so much. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me. This has been lots of fun.
Yeah, we've been planning trying to get you on for a while. All right, so for everybody else, we hope you'll visit babiesincommon.com/show to see the recording of this, or go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts to listen to the podcast. And Melissa.
Yeah, like us on Facebook. Consider taking a class with us if you're pregnant, or a virtual lactation consult or support group if you are postpartum. And I know, Teresa, you had mentioned before we started the recording that you're going to be starting up some of your online workshops, maybe in June, July, or August. And I have to say that if you don't feel like you're quite ready for a personalized one-on-one consult with Teresa, doing one of her workshops is so amazing. They're very affordable. They're and it's just a great way to learn about your specific baby's age group and get some tailored advice about your particular baby. So there's lots of things that Teresa offers, and you can check it out on our website. I hope that you do. we hope you'll be joining us again for other episodes. We want to be a community for you, even if we can't be with you. After all, we all have babies in common. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you, Teresa.
Yeah.
Thank you.